The pressure hull is screaming. It's not a vocal sound, but the terrifying groan of steel being compressed by the Sea of Japan. Inside the USS Spadefish, the emergency lights are shattered. The air smells of hydraulic fluid and fear. It is June 1945. The Tsushima Strait, 180 feet down. Above them, a hunter-killer group of 3 Japanese Shimusha-class escorts is circling. The captain, Commander William Jermersausen, grips the chart table as the high-pitched screech of active sonar strikes the hull. Bing! It hits them like a physical blow. The Japanese Type 93 sonar has them locked. The mathematics of this moment are brutal. The water is 38 degrees. Oxygen is at 14%. And the Spadefish is pinned against the sea floor. Jermersausen has tried everything in the naval manual. Silent running. Thermal layer evasion. Full stop. Nothing is shaking the enemy. The Japanese captain above is a veteran, and he is dropping Type 2 depth charges with surgical precision. In 3 minutes, the Spadefish will be crushed. But what the commander doesn't know is that the solution to this tactical nightmare isn't in the regulations. He doesn't know that crouched under the chart table, trembling in a wool cap, is a 14-year-old stowaway named Thomas Calder. And he definitely doesn't know that this dock rat, who snuck aboard for a fun joyride, has just come up with a stupid idea involving the ship's garbage that is about to baffle the entire Japanese Navy. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. To understand why a 14-year-old boy had to save a United States submarine, you have to understand how a submarine dies. In 1945, the Japanese Kaiboken escorts didn't need to hit the Spadefish directly. Water is incompressible. A depth charge exploding even 50 feet away sends a shockwave fast enough to snap the keel and rupture the pressure hull. But the explosive isn't the real enemy. The enemy is the ping. Active sonar works by sending out a pulse of sound. When it hits the metal skin of a submarine, it bounces back, a clear, hard echo that tells the destroyer exactly where to drop the explosives. Naval Command spent millions developing electronic jammers and chemical Foxer decoys to confuse this system. But the Spadefish is out of decoys. They are naked in the water. Standard doctrine says you sit still and pray. But sitting still is getting them killed. The experts, the acoustical engineers and Annapolis graduates, see the ocean as a math problem. Thomas Calder sees it differently. He's a kid who spent the last 3 weeks peeling potatoes in the galley as punishment for stowing away. He possesses 0 military training. He has never fired a torpedo. But while the crew sees the Trash Disposal Unit, TDU, as a way to get rid of waste, Thomas remembers a lecture from the sonar operator about how sound waves fracture against density. He is about to propose something that sounds insane, taking the submarine's trash, crushed tins, silverware and jagged metal, and firing it right back at the enemy. It's a desperate gamble. If it fails, the noise of the ejection will pinpoint their location and kill them instantly. If it works, this joyride mistake might just become the most classified event of the war. Here is the true story of the boy who threw garbage at the Japanese Imperial Navy and won. By June 1945, the Pacific War had evolved from a strategic chess match into a brutal, close-quarters knife fight in the dark. The USS Spadefish was no longer hunting merchant convoys in open water. She was prowling the Tsushima Strait, the narrow, heavily mined gateway between Korea and Japan. This was the Empire's backyard, and they defended it with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. The ocean floor here wasn't just mud and silt. It was a graveyard of steel, littered with the crushed hulls of American boats that had pushed their Luck 1 patrol too far. For the 80 men aboard Spadefish, the terror wasn't the enemy they could see through the periscope. It was the invisible energy hunting them through the black water. The Japanese Kaiboken escorts above weren't blindly dropping explosives anymore. They were listening. The technology that pinned them to the seabed was active sonar, a system the Japanese had refined with lethal efficiency. The destroyer above didn't just listen for engine noise, it screamed into the void. A transducer on the enemy keel emitted a high-frequency pulse of sound, a ping, that traveled through the water at 1,500 meters per second. When that sound wave struck the pressure hull of the Spadefish, it didn't pass through. It bounced back. To the sonar operator in the warm, dry control room of the destroyer, that returning echo was a death sentence. By measuring the time it took for the ping to return, he could calculate the range. By measuring the angle, he found the bearing. It was simple trigonometry weaponized. Once they had a fix, they didn't need to see the sub. They just needed to execute the geometry of the kill. and the kill was efficient. A Type 2 depth charge didn't need to strike the submarine to destroy it. The physics of underwater explosions ensured that a near miss was just as catastrophic. Water, unlike air, is incompressible. When 350 pounds of Shermos powder detonated, the energy had nowhere to go but out, traveling as a supersonic shockwave. If that hammer blow struck within 30 feet of the spadefish, the steel plates wouldn't just bend, they would shatter. Hydraulics would burst, flinging pressurized oil like shrapnel. The battery wells would crack, mixing acid with seawater to create deadly chlorine gas. The ocean would force its way in, faster than any human reflex could stop it. Commander Jermersausen knew these stakes intimately. He knew that the Kaiboken captains worked in teams, triangulating the echoes to create a box of explosions from which there was no escape. The spadefish was currently sitting in the center of that box. The pinging was getting faster, the sonar equivalent of a heart racing before the kill. The intervals between the metallic screeches were shortening, meaning the destroyer was closing the distance. They were about to be hammered, and the only thing standing between the crew and the crushing dark was an inch of high-tensile steel and the terrifying silence of men waiting to die. But as the first explosions began to walk the water closer to their position, shaking dust from the overheads, the commander's eyes weren't on the depth gauge. They were fixed on the impossible anomaly huddled beneath his chart table, a trembling variable that no Naval Academy textbook had ever accounted for. Thomas Calder didn't hate the Japanese Empire. At 14, he mostly hated the silence of his empty house in Honolulu. His father, a machinist's mate, had vanished in the fireball of the USS Arizona on December 7, 1941, leaving Thomas with a folded flag and a hollow chest. By May 1945, Thomas had become a dock rat, a fixture of the Pearl Harbor submarine base, running errands for sailors and soaking up their stories like a sponge. They were giants to him, smelling of diesel and adventure, everything his father had been. When a petty officer bet him a pack of gum he wouldn't dare touch the hull of the spadefish, Thomas didn't just touch it. He saw an open opportunity. The forward torpedo loading hatch was open, a steep, angled throat designed to swallow Mark 14 torpedoes. Amidst the chaos of loading crates of lettuce and canned peaches, Thomas saw his chance. He wasn't thinking about the Pacific War. He was thinking about a joyride, a quick surface transit to San Francisco where he had an aunt. He made himself small, sliding down the skid and wedging his skinny frame behind a stack of hydraulic spares in the forward torpedo room. He fell asleep to the sounds of loading. When he woke up, the world had changed. The rhythmic rocking of the ocean swell was gone, replaced by a smooth, terrifying stillness and the electric hum of ventilation fans. The air pressure in his ears popped painfully. They were submerged. The joyride was over. He was in a sealed steel tube headed for the kill zone. Hunger drove him out of hiding 48 hours later. He was caught almost immediately by the chief of the boat, COB, a man with forearms the size of cured hams. Thomas was dragged by his collar through the watertight doors, past gawking sailors, and deposited onto the linoleum floor of the wardroom. Commander Jermersausen didn't yell. That would have been better. Instead, he looked at Thomas with the cold, calculated detachment of a man deciding whether to jettison a broken part. The captain was a Naval Academy graduate responsible for the lives of 80 men and a $6 million war machine. "We are 3,000 miles from home, son," Jermersausen said, his voice flat. "We burn 15 gallons of diesel per mile. We carry limited oxygen, limited water, and limited food. You are not a sailor. You are baggage. You are a caloric liability." There was no turning back. The mission orders were sealed and paramount. Thomas wasn't thrown in the brig. Space was too valuable for a cell. Instead, he was exiled to the bottom of the social hierarchy, the galley. He became the property of the ship's cook, stripped of his dignity and forced to peel mountains of potatoes in a space no bigger than a closet. He was the tourist, a pariah who had invaded their fraternity of survival. But as Thomas scrubbed grease traps and hauled trash, he found himself listening to the strange rhythmic pinging noises coming from the sonar shack next door, and the red-headed sailor who sat there wearing headphones like a crown. The only place on the spadefish where Thomas wasn't treated like a disease was the sonar shack. It was a cramped closet jammed between the control room and the radio room, smelling of ozone and stale coffee. Here reigned sonarman first class Red O'Malley, a man who lived with headphones permanently clamped over his ears, listening to the ocean's secrets while the rest of the crew slept. Thomas would sneak in during the mid-watch, bringing fresh coffee from the galley as a bribe. O'Malley, bored and appreciative of the caffeine, began to tolerate the boy's presence. It was here, amidst the glowing dials and the hum of the QC active sonar stack, that Thomas received the education that would matter more than any high school diploma. "You think the ocean is quiet?" O'Malley muttered one night, tapping the headset. "It's a riot out there. Snapping shrimp, croaking fish, grinding rocks. My job isn't to hear the noise. It's to hear the pattern in the noise." He taught Thomas about the baffles, the blind spot directly behind the submarine where the turbulence of their own screws deafened the hydrophones, leaving them vulnerable to a stalker. But the most critical lesson was about the density layer, or thermocline. O'Malley explained that where cold deep water met warm surface water, it created a barrier as hard as glass to sound waves. "Sound is lazy, kid," O'Malley said, sketching on a notepad. "It bends toward the slower medium. If we hide under a cold layer, the Jap sonar pings bounce off the temperature shift just like light hitting a mirror. We disappear." Thomas watched the green light of the bearing indicator, his eyes wide. He didn't see the math, he saw the picture. To him, the active sonar ping wasn't just a noise, it was a physical thing like a pebble thrown into a still pond. The ripples went out, hit the hull, and bounced back. "So," Thomas whispered, staring at the equipment, "the destroyer doesn't actually see us. It just sees the echo we make." "Exactly," O'Malley nodded. "If the echo is wrong, their map is wrong. We're just a ghost in the machine until that ping touches steel." Thomas closed his eyes, visualizing the sound waves moving through the dark water. He imagined the spadefish not as a boat, but as a void in the water, a shape defined only by what it reflected. If you could change the reflection, you could change the shape. If you could mess up the ripples, the person throwing the pebble wouldn't know what they had hit. It was a fascinating game of hide and seek, until the red light on the bulkhead suddenly flared to life. The casual atmosphere in the shack evaporated instantly. O'Malley pressed the headphones tight against his skull, his face draining of color. "Screw noises," O'Malley hissed, spinning the bearing handle. "Fast screws. Constant bearing, decreasing range. They aren't looking for fish, Thomas. They're in a sprint." The game was over. The ripples were coming for them. The spadefish didn't just poke the bear, she gutted it. Two Mark 18 electric torpedoes left the forward tubes with a hiss of compressed air, running true and silent. 90 seconds later, the 5,000-ton Japanese troop transport shuddered as its keel snapped, sending a fireball rolling up toward the surface. The crew of the spadefish had exactly 4 seconds of satisfaction before the ocean turned against them. On the sonar stack, O'Malley didn't hear the chaotic breaking up of the transport. He heard the high-pitched whine of vengeance. "Escorts are turning. High-speed screws closing fast. Bearing 040, 080, and 180. They've got us boxed, Captain." 3 Shimusha-class escorts, specialized hunter-killers designed for one purpose, digging submarines out of the deep. Commander Jermersausen barked orders, his voice tight. "Right full rudder. All ahead flank. Take us down to 200 feet. But the spadefish was tired. The approach had drained her batteries to dangerous levels. As the electricians threw the levers to draw maximum amperage, the voltage dropped. The screws turned sluggishly. The boat felt heavy, dragging through the water like a stone. They weren't fast enough to slip the net. "Battery gravity is critical, sir," the maneuvering watch reported. "We can't sustain flank speed." Jermersausen made the only choice left, the choice every submarine captain dreads. "All stop. Settle her on the bottom. Rig for absolute silence." The electric motors whined down to nothing. The spadefish drifted down, her keel gently grinding into the silt of the Tsushima Strait at 180 feet. Then the waiting began. The silence was suffocating. 80 men froze, some holding rags over their mouths to stifle coughs. Even the ventilation was cut to prevent noise. The air began to grow heavy and hot. Then came the click. It was a sharp, metallic sound, like a hammer striking an anvil underwater. A split second later, crack WM. The ocean floor heaved. The spadefish was kicked sideways by the shockwave. In the control room, a pressure gauge exploded, showering the chart table with glass. Cork insulation rained down from the overheads like black snow. Thomas, huddled under the table, was thrown violently against a steel stanchion. He felt a sharp sting above his eye. He reached up, his hand coming away wet and sticky with blood. But he didn't cry out. He couldn't breath. "That was close," O'Malley whispered, his face pale. "That was the click-bang. When you hear the solenoid click before the explosion, it means they're right on top of us." Another click. Another hammer blow, closer this time. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into emergency red. The hull groaned, the steel plates compressing under the dual assault of hydrostatic pressure and high explosives. They were taking water in the bilges. The Japanese captain above wasn't guessing anymore. He had a solid contact, and he was methodically dismantling the American submarine piece by piece. Germershausen stared at the depth gauge, knowing that if they stayed, they died. If they surfaced, they died. They were out of options, out of power, and out of time. Commander Germershausen stared at the rivets on the bulkhead, watching them weep condensation. The air in the control room was foul, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rising CO2. The Japanese destroyer had just completed another run, the explosions close enough to knock the wind out of the crew. They were trapped in a geometric kill box. Germershausen knew the endgame. The batteries were too weak to sneak away. If they stayed, the pressure hull would eventually fail. His duty was to the boat, but his conscience was screaming about the civilian child huddled in the corner. He ran the calculus, surfaced the boat, scuttle her, get the crew, and the boy, into life rafts before the Japanese opened fire with 4.7-inch guns. It would be a disgrace, a surrender, but it might save the kid. He reached for the 1MC microphone to order the surface, his hand trembling slightly. In the galley, Thomas was trying to make himself invisible. The terror had made his hands numb. As a fresh shockwave slammed the boat, the deck tilted violently. Thomas grabbed for a handhold and missed, his arm sweeping a stack of aluminum mesh trays and steel cutlery off the counter. Clang crash. The sound was deafening in the rigged-for-silence boat. It cut through the tension like a gunshot. Heads snapped toward the galley with looks of pure murder. Thomas froze, staring down at the pile of bent aluminum and scattered steel forks, expecting the chief of the boat to tear him apart. But as he looked at the jagged reflection of the emergency light on the metal, something clicked in his brain. It wasn't the sound of the crash that mattered, it was the material. He remembered O'Malley's words, "Sonar is just an echo. It bounces off hard things." Thomas looked at the crushed tin cans in the waste bin waiting for the TDU, trash disposal unit. He looked at the silverware. Standard Navy decoys were chemical pillows of hydrogen bubbles designed to create a soft cloud that looked like a wake. But bubbles were just gas. They didn't ring like steel. The Japanese sonar wasn't looking for bubbles. It was looking for a hull. It was looking for metal. Thomas realized they had been trying to hide the sub by being quiet. But you couldn't hide from a flashlight in a dark room just by holding your breath. You hid by blinding the guy holding the light. You needed a reflection brighter than the target. Not bubbles, Thomas whispered to himself, picking up a crushed can of peaches. Solid. If they ejected the trash, not just food waste but everything, the crushed tins, the jagged lids, the forks, the spoons, it wouldn't just float. For a few critical minutes, as it tumbled in the water column, it would create a dense, swirling cloud of metal shrapnel. A hard return. A wall of false echoes that would flare on the Japanese scope like a supernova, masking the real submarine behind it. It was a stupid idea. It was technically illegal. Ejecting trash while under attack was forbidden because debris floating to the surface usually confirmed a hit to the enemy. But Thomas wasn't thinking about the surface visual. He was thinking about the underwater acoustic shadow. He scrambled up from the deck, gripping the crushed can like a grenade, and ran toward the control room, ignoring the silent running order. He had to stop the captain from surrendering. Thomas Calder burst into the control room like a live wire sparking in a powder magazine. He was wearing his oversized wool cap, his face smeared with grease, and in his hand, he clutched a crushed number 10 can of peaches. "Captain," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Throw the trash out. We have to throw the trash out right now." The silence in the control room shattered. Every head snapped toward the intruder. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Miller, moved instantly. He saw a civilian boy who had finally snapped under the pressure, a liability who was about to make noise that would get them all killed. Miller grabbed Thomas by the shoulder of his sweater, his grip iron hard. "Get him out of here," Miller hissed to the chief of the boat. "Sedate him if you have to. We are trying to save this boat. No. Listen to me." Thomas fought against the Exos grip, slamming the tin can onto the chart table. The metallic thud was shocking. "It's not garbage. It's tin. It rattles. It'll look like a wall of steel on their screen." Germershausen turned slowly from the periscope well. He looked at the boy, then at the crushed can on the map. "Let him go, Exo," he said quietly. Thomas stood panting, pointing at the chart. "Mr. O'Malley said the sonar is just a flashlight in the dark. It sees hard things. If we shoot the chemical bubbles, they know it's fake because it's soft. But this..." He shook the can. "This is hard. If we fill the water with thousands of these and the silverware and the spare parts, When the ping hits it, it won't just go through. It'll bounce back everywhere. It'll look like the sub is exploding, or like there's a wall of steel where we aren't. The crew looked at the boy as if he were speaking a foreign language. Using the TDU during evasion was suicide. Floating debris marked the grave of a sub. But from the sonar shack, a voice cut through the skepticism. "He's right, Captain." Red O'Malley stepped into the control room, his headphones around his neck. He looked at the crushed Ken, then at the captain. "Sir, the kid is describing an acoustic dazzle. We've been trying to hide from the ping. He's suggesting we overload it." O'Malley picked up the can. A compressed tin can has multiple reflective angles. It's dense. If we eject a concentrated column of this, along with the cutlery, it won't just be a cloud. It will create a high target strength return. The Japanese operator will see a massive solid contact bloom on his scope. It'll look like a hull rupture or a false target equal to our own cross-section. "It's underwater chaff," the XO murmured, the realization dawning on him. "Like the foil strips the bombers dropped to blind radar. But for sound." "Exactly," O'Malley nodded. "The density of the metal cloud will refract the signal. It might buy us 2 minutes of confusion. Maybe 3. Jermershausen looked at the depth gauge. The hull groaned again. They didn't have 3 minutes. He looked at Thomas, the stowaway who should have been in school, now proposing a tactic that defied every regulation in the book. "If we do this," the captain said, his voice low, "the noise of the ejection plunger alone gives them a perfect fix. We have to time it exactly with their active ping. If we miss by a second, we're dead." He looked at the chief of the boat. "Chief, empty the galley. I want every can, every spoon, every spare bolt loaded into the TDU. Now." The order that passed down the line was unlike any command ever issued in the history of the United States Navy. "Pass the trash." It started in the galley and snaked back through the crew's mess, a desperate bucket brigade of sweating, terrified men. They weren't passing ammunition or damage control timbers. They were passing sacks of crushed number 10 peach cans, bent stainless steel mesh trays, and handfuls of silverware that Thomas and the cook had frantically swept into canvas bags. In the small machinery space aft of the galley, the chief of the boat stood over the trash disposal unit, TDU. It was a vertical steel tube, essentially a miniature torpedo launcher designed for garbage, with a ball valve on top and a C valve on the bottom. Under normal conditions, operating the TDU at 180 feet was dangerous. The sea pressure was immense, and a mistake with the interlocks could flood the compartment in seconds. Under combat conditions, it was suicide. The hydraulic flush of the ejector created a distinct whoosh clank that would ring out on the enemy's hydrophones like a dinner bell. "Pressure equalized," the chief whispered, his hands slick with sweat on the bronze wheel. "Inner door shut. Ready to flush." In the sonar shack, Red O'Malley was the conductor of this insane orchestra. He was watching the stopwatch, timing the rhythm of the Japanese active sonar. Ping, silence. Ping, silence. The interval was 4 seconds. They had to fire the TDU exactly as the next ping struck the hull, using the enemy's own noise to mask the sound of the ejection. "Stand by," O'Malley hissed into the headset connected to the control room. "Ping in 3, 1, mark. Fire." Jermershausen ordered. The chief yanked the flush lever. Compressed air and seawater slammed into the TDU column. There was a shudder, a groan of hydraulics, and a muffled metallic rattle as 50 pounds of jagged steel and aluminum were forcibly vomited out of the bottom of the submarine. Outside the hull, the Calder chaff entered the water column. The crushed cans, no longer under the crushing grip of the ship's compactor, began to tumble and drift. The silverware spun like shimmering coins. The mesh trays fluttered. Above them, on the bridge of the Japanese escort Akuru, the sonar operator suddenly recoiled, ripping his headset away. A massive, chaotic screech had just erupted in his ears. The clean, sharp ping he had been tracking was gone. In its place was a blooming, jagged cloud of noise. The sound waves from his ship were hitting thousands of spinning metal surfaces, each one reflecting the energy at a different angle. "Contact is blooming," the operator shouted to his captain. "Target is breaking up. Multiple returns. I have metal everywhere." On the scope, the single defined dot of the American submarine dissolved into a fuzzy, massive smear that looked 5 times larger than a boat. The dense cloud of metal hung in the water, creating a perfect acoustic mirror, a false bottom that dazzled the sensors. The operator couldn't see the spadefish anymore. He could only see the screaming wall of noise that Thomas Calder had put between them. The Japanese captain, seeing the massive return, assumed the submarine had either imploded or deployed a massive new weapon, and he roared the order to fire everything they had at the center of the cloud. The reaction from the surface was immediate and apocalyptic. The Japanese Kaiboken commander, seeing the massive, shimmering acoustic bloom on his sonar screen, concluded he had either forced the submarine to surface or triggered a catastrophic hull rupture. He didn't wait for confirmation. He ordered a full pattern drop. 400 yards astern of the Spadefish, the ocean was torn apart. A barrage of Type 2 depth charges plummeted into the column of sinking trash, detonating in a synchronized fury. Inside the submarine, the sound wasn't the sharp, terrifying crack of a near miss. It was a dull, rolling thunder, a continuous roar that vibrated through the deck plates but didn't shatter the light bulbs. The shock waves were hammering the Calder chaff, the cloud of shredded peaches cans and twisted forks, pulverizing the garbage into oblivion. Commander Jermershausen gripped the periscope shears, his knuckles white. He knew the physics of sound better than anyone in the room. The chaotic noise of the explosions was deafening the enemy sonar, creating a temporary wall of acoustic static. For the next few minutes, the Japanese were deaf. All ahead flank. Jermershausen roared, breaking the silence of the control room. Cavitate the screws. Get us the hell out of here. It was a reckless order under any other circumstance. Running the propellers at maximum speed at this depth would create cavitation bubbles, loud, popping pockets of vacuum that usually sounded like a freight train on sonar. But right now, the freight train was hidden inside a thunderstorm. The maneuvering room threw the levers. The electric motors screamed, drawing the last reserves of the battered batteries. The Spadefish lurched forward, shaking violently as she clawed her way through the water, putting distance between herself and the kill box. Thomas held onto the chart table, his eyes wide. He watched the needle on the speed log climb. 2 knots. 5 knots. 8 knots. They were sprinting blindly through the dark, riding the shock waves of their own trash. Range to target. Opening, O'Malley called out from the sonar shack, pressing the headphones so hard against his skull his fingers turned white. Explosions are holding at bearing 180. They're still pounding the debris field, Captain. They think we're still there. For 10 agonizing minutes, the Spadefish ran. The roar of the depth charges grew softer, fading from a terrifying thunder to a distant drumming, until finally, it was just a low rumble in the aft baffles. The Japanese destroyers were circling the cloud of silver confetti, dropping explosives on a ghost that wasn't there. Jermershausen watched the battery gauge. They were almost dead in the water, but they were safe. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since Pearl Harbor. All stop, he ordered quietly. Silent running. Secure from general quarters. The adrenaline crash hit the crew instantly. Men slumped against the bulkheads, sliding to the deck in pools of sweat. The air was still foul, the heat was oppressive, but the silence, the beautiful empty silence of the deep ocean, had returned. Thomas looked around the room. Nobody cheered. There were no high fives. Just the 1,000-yard stares of men who had heard their own graves being dug, and the boy who had handed them the shovel to fill it in. The USS Spadefish limped into Opera Harbor, Guam, under the cover of a moonless night in late June 1945. She was a battered wreck. Her pressure hull was scarred, her paint stripped by the concussive force of the depth charges, and her batteries were practically dead. To the shore command, she was just another boat returning from a successful patrol. But inside the pressure hull, a conspiracy was being finalized. Commander Jermershausen sat in his stateroom, the ship's logbook open before him. The ink was still fresh on the entry for the Tsushima Strait engagement. It detailed the sinking of the troop transport and the subsequent evasion. But where the narrative should have explained the anomalous acoustic cloud that saved their lives, the captain wrote only, evasion effected via radical maneuver and utilization of thermal gradients. He blotted the ink and closed the book. There was no mention of the trash disposal unit. There was no mention of Thomas Calder. To admit that a 14-year-old stowaway had devised a tactical countermeasure that outsmarted the Imperial Japanese Navy would invite a court-martial for the captain and a juvenile detention cell for the boy. The Navy didn't like miracles that broke regulations. At 0200 hours, a supply truck idled on the darkened pier. The crew formed a human wall near the gangway. Thomas Calder, dressed in ill-fitting dungarees cut down to his size, stood by the rail. He looked older than the boy who had slid down the torpedo loading hatch a month ago. His face was thin, his eyes hard. The chief of the boat, COB, the same giant who had threatened to throw him overboard, stepped forward. He didn't salute. Civilians don't get salutes, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver pin, the submariner's dolphins. He pressed it into Thomas's hand, along with the wool flat cap the boy had worn during the attack. "You earned your air, kid," the chief grunted, his voice rough. "Now get lost. And if anyone asks, you were never here." Thomas slipped down the gangway and vanished into the shadows of the supply depot. He was never charged. He never spoke of it. The crew of the Spadefish kept their pact, carrying the secret to their graves. But the ocean leaves a mark on a man, even a young one. Thomas Calder didn't go back to drifting on the docks. He used the discipline he learned in the terrifying silence of the deep to put himself through school. He eventually became a brilliant acoustical engineer, consulting for the Navy in the 1960s on expendable acoustic countermeasures. His colleagues often wondered why he had such an intuitive, almost instinctive understanding of how sound fractures against metal in deep water, but Thomas just smiled and blamed it on good theories. The only physical proof of his journey sits in a dusty box in the Naval Archives in Washington, D.C. It is a group photo of the USS Spadefish crew taken upon their return to Guam. If you look closely at the back row, half hidden behind the broad shoulder of a torpedo man, there is a blurry figure wearing a wool flat cap who looks far too young to be in uniform. He isn't looking at the camera. He's looking at the horizon, wide-eyed, as if he can still hear the ping. Thomas Calder saved 80 men and was rewarded by being erased from history. The Navy burned the logs to protect him, and for decades, his bravery was a secret buried at the bottom of the ocean. Don't let him be forgotten again. If you leave this video without subscribing, you're letting his story fade back into the dark just like the history books did. Hit like to honor the Spadefish and comment "Silent Service" below so the algorithm is forced to show this hero to the world.